Welcome to another Creative Spin podcast. And today, I have two good friends. This is a joke that's going on. I don't know if you've seen it, but the one, the only, the most amazing.
Right?
No, let's not call. Listen, I've never said that. Okay, probably once or twice. But okay, I'm getting in trouble. It's like 30 seconds in. Today we're going to, me and my partner in crime will be talking to someone about some creative writing.
Sure.
It's a creative spin. It's got to be a creative writing,
Hey,
of course.
listen, there's a
right?
spin to it.
So we'll be talking about how this all started, how this is going, plans for the future. If you can say anything, I'm not sure. Nah. We'll just keep on going. This will be a nice conversation. He's a guest and he's a friend and a colleague.
Yes.
So this should be an interesting conversation. So let's hit that intro and get back. Today's podcast is brought to you by Workplace One, a company offering boutique private offices, co-working spaces, and virtual office solutions, as well as meeting rooms in the best neighborhoods of Toronto and Kitchener-Waterloo. Ideal for entrepreneurs, companies, and passionate business people. Workplace One is where you want to be with your business. For more information, go over to workplaceone.com. So Anna,
Hi.
you brought your colleague today.
Yes, I
Can
did.
you-
The
can
one
you
and
introduce
only
your
Anthony
colleague to
Tsa.
us?
I'm
Anthony,
so
welcome.
happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Anthony, thank you for being here. You know that besides being a colleague and a very good friend, I am your fan. I admire you since the very first day. It's funny, I did not know Anthony personally when he published Barnacle Love.
This
I
one,
met you at York University. I don't know if you recall
Yes.
that. Yes.
Even though we went to high school together.
The same high school, right?
That's kind of
That's
crazy.
weird.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And now you're teaching in the same high school, which is even weirder.
Yes, I know. I know.
So I remember that when this book, it was a friend of mine when I was at the other school who brought me Barnacle Love and said, by the way, Anthony Tsa is a teacher and he works for our board. And I fell in love with Barnacle Love. And then I met you at York University and it's just... I started there, so thank you for being here for sharing. And
we've been trying to get Anthony here for a while, but
He's
he's
busy.
Schedule just didn't
He's
allow
busy.
it.
his people were talking to our
I
people, and we're
know.
trying to get
I
things,
know.
and it was kind of difficult. But you're here now, and we thank you for that. And I think the best way to start this off is I'm asking all of my guests is the origin story. Like, give us a little synopsis of who Anthony is.
God, I was going to
Yeah.
answer that question by saying Anthony shouldn't. So let me.
And this is why we like him.
who Anthony is, or okay, I'll answer that question.
Like,
I'm
where were
still-
you born? What did you like to do?
Because that's a big question.
And
If you
then
say to me
Anthony,
who
the
Anthony
author.
is, I would say Anthony is still trying to figure out who Anthony is
Which is
at
always a good thing.
53. Yeah. But let me just say, I am the son of Portuguese immigrants who immigrated from the Azores. My father was one of the very first to come to Canada in 55. And my mother followed suit about 6 years after that. So they were really here at the very beginning of that community when there really wasn't much of a community.
Yeah.
It was
And,
like a little village, really.
Yes, and it was and because of that, there were so many things that felt different for them. I think because they were really felt isolated. So I am first generation. I was born and raised in Toronto, and this is my neighborhood, which is the kind of cradle of the Portuguese immigrant during the 50s and 60s and 70s, and still for the most part, although a great deal of gentrification has happened in this neighborhood, still you see the flavor of those Portuguese
By the way,
homes.
for those of you that don't know where we are, we're on Queen West here in Toronto. So this is the area where you grew up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so grew up like, I guess, every other Portuguese kid in the neighborhood, except I didn't look Portuguese.
That is true.
I was blonde, I was blue-eyed, and for the most part, I didn't feel it either. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but
you didn't have friends that were Portuguese?
all
or-
of my friends were
all
Portuguese.
of your friends. Okay.
But they were all dark-eyed, dark hair, dark skin.
So you're the outsider.
I was the anomaly, and for many years thought that there must have been some kind of foul play with my mother and the milkman or something. I don't know. No, until I realized that, I saw pictures of my dad who was younger and was also blue-eyed and blonde-haired.
My dad has also blue eyes and blonde
But
hair,
it wasn't the norm.
No,
It's
it
not.
wasn't.
It certainly wasn't the norm. And my mom, who was just absolutely beautiful, and olive skin and dark hair and brown eyes. I remember she used to say to me when she'd pull me along in the stroller, how everyone just assumed she was the caregiver as opposed to
Your
the
mother.
mother. So it was, and there were other factors that made me feel so much more marginalized than I think the average Portuguese kid did in the neighborhood. But yes, this was my home, this was my family, and that's where I grew up. And the result of that Portugueseness meant that, my dad had and my mom had dreams for me, and those dreams did not entail a world of art or design or creativity.
It's interesting because that was always an issue within our culture. I felt it as well. Like when I was drawing, my mom would just say, there you are ruining some
Wasting
more paper.
paper,
yeah.
You're just wasting paper,
Yeah.
And they didn't see the art as something that you could actually do something with.
No, and I told the story recently that I hadn't shared with many people. I remember being in grade 13, and I had applied, and one of the places I had applied to was OCAD. And I remember I worked very hard to get my portfolio ready for my big interview, and I went to the interview and all was good. And I remember in May, I think, this was quite a while ago, I received my acceptance to OCAD, and I remember feeling so overjoyed. And I remember folding that acceptance and stuffing it between my mattress. And then about 2 weeks later, I got this acceptance from the University of Toronto, St. George campus, with this big embossed coat of arms. And it said that I had been accepted to
Hogwarts.
yes.
No, sorry.
Yes. And I remember that day. Walking downstairs to the basement where my father sat. And I remember handing him that acceptance letter. And I can still see him put on his reading glasses and reading it and then getting up and leaving because he was so emotional and overwhelmed. But I also remember walking up the stairs from the basement, saying to myself in my head over and over again, I did the right thing, I did the right thing, I did the right thing.
So where was your heart?
I did the right thing for him. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of that generation, that time, there was a great deal of pressure to fulfill the dreams, not necessarily that you had, but the ones that your parents sacrificed so much.
There was a lot of those values going on.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, values is a kind way of putting it. Sometimes it was bribery. Sometimes it was, there was no option, right? I mean, that's not why they came to this country, for me to draw pictures.
Yeah, exactly.
That is not why they came. I could be a doctor. I could be a lawyer. And after my father saw an episode of The Brady Bunch, I could be an architect because he liked the house they lived in. They had a maid. So he thought that would be really fantastic as well.
I mean, but we need to understand where they were coming from.
Of course.
Right? I mean,
Yeah,
then, coming from such poverty back in the day in Portugal, I mean, one would assume that it's obvious that you come into a new country, you just want to make money for the sense of having that security for yourself and for your children.
And show
right?
off. Those careers were meant that you made it in life.
Yeah, there was always that pride, that pride to
you
show
made
off.
it.
Yeah, you're
You
right.
made
You're
it.
right.
Well, but see, this is where I take a more sinister turn. It didn't only show that I had made it. It showed that parents
Exactly.
had done everything right.
Yeah.
And so now listen, I say this story without any regret. No regret whatsoever, because I loved I loved going to the university.
But I love listening to these stories of the what ifs.
The what ifs. Yes.
Yeah,
And
these are really good.
And the nice thing about the what ifs is, what if all of a sudden 20 years later, you still get to fulfill the dream of being creative.
Yeah.
And manage somehow to put food on the table too. So
That's an important
so
part.
that's an
yeah.
important part of the whole thing. But yeah, so that's where it all came from. That's a little taste of who I am.
Because I know you and I know a little bit of your story, you sort of put that away though, like aside, I would say, for a few years, because the creative writing aspect, you only look at it when you're already a teacher and a few years after finishing university, right? Like
Right. So I think I had been teaching about 15 years.
Yeah.
I was an English teacher, still am. Loved fiction, loved the world of words, the play of words, the creativity of it.
Were you an avid reader?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Books were my world. Books were my escape. Because also growing up in that kind of family where certain social issues reared their ugly head. My father took to drinking, and it was a tumultuous time growing up. And so my favorite place was Sanderson Library here on the corner of Bathurst and Dundas. And Sanderson Library and the librarians there afforded me books that could show me that my family wasn't so far up from the families in these worlds, but it also gave me the opportunity to explore different families and different worlds, and I can escape into those and ask that same question, what if? But yeah, books were a very, very big part of growing up.
You then become an English teacher. You teach English.
15 years,
15
teach
years.
English. I finally have a sabbatical, and I have this whole year off, and I don't know what I'm going to do. I had this idea that I was going to travel through China and India, and I remember that first day, the day after Labor Day, when I'm supposed to be working, but I'm beginning this venture, and I look at my wife in the kitchen with my 3 boys, age 5, 3, 1.5. And I turned to my wife and I said, "We're not going anywhere, are we?" And she said, "No, we're not going anywhere with these guys." And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to stay at home and I'm going to be the best dad these kids have ever had, And that lasted about 2 weeks. And my wife said, "Get the hell out of the house because you better get out of here." And so I actually enrolled at OCAD. And that's where I took up painting and writing, and that became the very beginning of my first book, Barnacle Love.
Interesting.
What inspired you at that point to write Barnacle Love? Was it
the spark that you were that kind of came from going back to OCAD and trying these things that you always wanted to do?
I guess, you know what, the spark, it's an interesting question. I think, I started taking some creative writing classes. I mean, I used to love reading books. I didn't know the first thing about writing a book.
It's 2 different beasts.
It's a very different beast. And so I kept on hearing this adage, write what you know, write what you know. So I thought, okay. And I also kept on hearing in my mind how difficult the publishing was, how competitive it was to actually get published, to get recognized, to get noticed, unless you had a story that hadn't been told. Now, I'm a firm believer that there is no story that has never been told. It just needs to be told in a different way.
Different angle.
And really, no one in this country, a land of immigrants, had ever told the story of the Portuguese immigrant. And there are subtleties and differences. Sure, there are commonalities between all ethnic diversities, but there are certain things that are
That makes us Portuguese.
Yes, that makes us who we are. And that's what I did. That's how I ventured into Barnacle Love. I thought, okay, I'm going to write what you know. I'm going to use my mom, and I'm going to use my dad, and I'm going to use me and my sister, and I'm going to create this family, and I'm going to...
Yet it's not an autobiography.
No, it's not.
No.
No, because what happens is that you begin to realize that your actual story is a lot is not as exciting as you would like it to be. And the world
very
of
similar
fiction,
to everybody else around you, right?
yes. And
Yeah.
how do you make that different? And so you start tweaking the story and changing it, and before you know it, it becomes a very different thing, an entity all in its own. I remember when we were going to put this book to bed, and I turned to my editor at one point, this was over the phone, and I said, "Oh, Martha, I'm so happy that we're done. So can I just confess one thing and then we'll move on?" She goes, "Sure, what is it?" I said, "Okay, so my father's name was Manuel, and my mother's name was Georgina, and my sister's name was Trezinha, and I am Anthony, but I called him Antonio in the novel. So now that it's all done, let me change the names. Let me have Joe, Eduarda, let me just change.
Go for the common
change
names.
the names." And there was dead silence on the phone. And she said to me, she goes, "How would you feel if we kept them?" And I said, "Can I ask why?" She says, "Well, I've lived with you in this book for 2 years, and I can't imagine them having any other names than what you gave them. And if you're comfortable with it, are you comfortable with it?" And I said, "You know what, Martha, it's funny you say that, because although they share the names of my family members, they have ceased to be those people. They've taken on fictional lives of their own. And so I'm quite comfortable. I just thought you wouldn't be." And so we left all of those names and continued that family saga in my second book, Kicking the Sky.
Yes, and Kicking the Sky. I told you at the time, you made me question myself, because I was born here.
phones.
You leave your phones. my
I
goodness.
know.
I was born in Toronto, but moved to Portugal when I was 5. So I lost the language. I lost my connection to Canada, and coming back to grade 9, Canada was, in a way, I was part of that wave of immigrants, right? That was sort of
From the 80s, yeah.
coming to a strange land, right? And I found my voice in Kicking the Sky, even though it's a different era, different time. But I remember my dad talking about Emmanuel Jacques. And when you told me that this was going to be the book and that you were going to... I feel, and I agree with you, that was the moment our community gained a voice in the sense of identity. But I have to say that you do it in a way that you question taboos in our community, in our culture. I was tired sometimes, because I was one of those kids running, through the alleyways and on the rooftops, and I'm like, I'm one of these kids. I want to. And it was, as I was reading your book, and I get into it, and they sometimes scare me because I forget that the world exists around me, right? But why did you choose? Was it because you felt like you had to give this voice? You had to tell the world that this is the moment when we became a community, but we also lost our inness.
I think we also need to kind of explain a little bit, because we have viewers from
Yes.
all over the
I'm
world.
gonna
So
let him-
a little preview of what it was based on.
A little summary. Kicking the Sky is based on the real life murder, 1977 murder of a young 12-year-old shoeshine boy on Yonge Street, who was lured away with the promise of moving some photo equipment for $35. And subsequently, he was beaten and raped by 3 men, and then drowned in a kitchen sink, and then put on a rooftop dead, and the men escaped. And so it centers around that pivotal murder in Toronto, where Toronto's moniker of Toronto the Good was challenged for the first time. It ceased to be that place. And the city's history changed as a result of that murder. And a community found its voice.
Yep.
And politicians took notice. And all of these things happened. So that's really the crux of the novel. That being said, the novel is not about the murder.
Exactly.
The novel is about how a few young boys and some of the adults in their lives react to the murder, to what's happened to
Basically,
them.
the ripple effect.
It's
of
the
that.
ripple effect.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just the Portuguese community. It goes to the whole city, to the whole sense of who are we, why are we not safe in our city?
Yeah. What is this Toronto?
What is this Toronto? It questions that. So that's essentially that's essentially the background of the book. Now back to your question, Anna. It's twofold. So the first thing is there was real interest by my publishing house to look at a very short story called The Shoeshine Boy in my first book, and taking that story and expanding it into a full-length novel, simply because it was a story that was so big, yet had not been explored in Canadian literature. So again, remember, trying to find a new story, trying to find a new angle, something that's never been done before. And I liked that idea, particularly because I was that age when that
affected
happened.
you.
And
lived
it affected me very much so. And it affected my family in a way, and my teachers, and my school, and my neighborhood, and these laneways just outside these windows.
Because you were more or less that age as well at
Exactly
that time.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
So I figured if someone is going to tell that story, it's got to be me. And I knew what it was to be a kid of immigrant parents living in downtown Toronto and feeling to a certain extent like you weren't getting an even shake. Like there were certain things that automatically you were already getting checked off for that you know that were disadvantaging you. And I was very cognizant of that, and so I wanted to reveal, as someone put it, you opened up the windows and the doors to my Portuguese household, and I don't like you for doing that. And yet that's what I liked about writing the book.
That's what I love.
Yes.
That's and I know that when I was when I actually went to present your book and you were the guest speaker at one of the clubs, Chasm Source, I tried, without wanting to spoil what the book was all about, I tried bringing that up. I said, you know what? It's these questions that we don't want to talk about. It's
that everybody knows and everybody talks about.
But it's also this division within the community that occurred around this, because all of a sudden you have within the community its own division as well, and it becomes especially two groups that become very mainland.
It's the different
Azers.
opinions.
No, but it does come out, at least that's my reading of it, and I was so glad that you did that, because I love questioning what no one wants to talk. I love bringing up what no one wants to talk about, the so-called taboos, or however you want to call them. But I feel like you completed that voice for the community with Kickin the Sky. And then,
thank you, but I didn't want that burden. But continue.
Well, my opinion.
Put some responsibility on it.
Then we go to Africa, and man.
Yeah, this adventure I want to know a lot more about, because
Children of the
this
Moon.
must have been an interesting one for you. You really decided to, okay, now I want to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I wrote two books that were very Toronto-centric, very immigrant-centric.
Yeah.
And I loved inhabiting those worlds, don't get me wrong. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that writers sometimes get pigeonholed, get
comfortable,
really like to do this one thing and then don't move away from it. And that's not to deny the fact that they continue to do a wonderful job at that.
For sure.
And I probably will go back and revisit this world that I grew up in. But I wanted to stretch. I wanted to move a little further afield. I mean, quite further afield, and set my next novel in Mozambique and in Tanzania. But I didn't want the constraints and the burden and the responsibility of trying to represent my community yet again. I think it's important that someone else do that now, if they see it in a different way, if they have a different voice about it. But for the most part, I wanted to explore another part still of a Portuguese heritage, but one further away from me.
Would you say you were looking for different challenges, bigger challenges probably?
Yes, I wanted to. So, we talked about write what you know. I did that, and I did it quite successfully. And I did it quite successfully because I'm pleased with my work, and it garnered certain critical acclaim, both books. I needed to do something else and wondered if I could do something else.
So stepping outside of that comfort zone.
Because I think that's what artists do, and that's what we do. We constantly are looking for that something else, something to satisfy us in a way. I mean, if you finish a book like Barnacle Love and you feel completely satisfied with your work, why would I do it again?
Yeah, it would just be repeating it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, so taking a chance. Maybe it's not as successful. Maybe it doesn't sell enough copies. Maybe it doesn't get listed for the awards. But the reward of putting my neck out there and being rewarded with something that I'm very proud of, that people come to me and say, I cannot believe you wrote that. I felt like I was there. I understand those characters because my uncle, my aunt, my grandfather. And that meant a great deal to me.
I had to read it twice. I told you at the time. I read it twice. And there are, as you can see, there's still a bookmark there. Like there are certain passages that I go to. When you said Children of the Moon, I said albinos because my connection to Africa, and I said, wow. So this is the voice now. And I feel like you do give a voice to albinos. That's what they're known as in Africa.
They're known as children of the moon. That is
right?
in some countries.
And I was not expecting. I was not expecting a story about colonial, because at some point that's what you're telling me, right? Colonial Portuguese Mozambique, to be. It usually what I read about Mozambique, whether it's fiction or not, it's harsh, does not interest me. It's very historical. You bring poetry to that without being poetry, with fiction. Yes. And the first time when I finished, I was like, it's like I didn't read it. It's like I missed so many points. I need to go back. And I felt a connection to Africa. And I've never been to Africa, but I have so many friends of mine that are. And I mean, I did African studies. And all of a sudden, you just brought this corner of the Portuguese Africa out. Again, not painting a lot of color. You bring out what it was to live in Africa, to go through the atrocities that especially albinos go through. But yet there is that hidden voice there that speaks to me at a different level. And I just need to commend you for that.
Thank you.
It was, this book is outstanding.
It was a challenge simply because I didn't want, as you rightly said, I mean, I could write a war story.
Exactly. And I mean, there's so many out there.
Wow. How many have I read?
Yeah.
And yet none of them have ever satisfied me because it feels so flat. Mm-hmm. For me, even in war, there needs to be a sense of humanity.
Yes.
Of beauty, of compassion. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to capture that. The ugliness of it goes without saying.
Yeah. And
I show, I think, a great deal of restraint. I don't go into the details.
No.
I let the reader imagine just how horrific that war could be. What fascinated me was, in the midst of this war, could there be love? Could there be a connection between two people who didn't feel like they belonged?
Yeah.
And I was fascinated with people with albinism. I was fascinated with their plight and what's happening with them in Africa. I found it horrendous when I read an article in the National Geographic, because up to that point I was writing a story that was war. Mm-hmm. A colonial war, and I wasn't satisfied.
Then it becomes human.
And then it becomes human when you add this element.
Colorful like that. And
yes.
so once I finished reading that book, I said, okay, now I understand this color. It was that color that it was missing from any other story that I found in Children of the Moon.
When you're there, run me through the process. Like when you're talking to people, when you're meeting these children, when you're meeting their families, do they know you're a writer? You're going to write about them? Like how
I
do
think
you,
they
how,
know.
how do
I
you
don't
approach
them?
Like,
I think they know. I don't think they quite understand.
Okay. But is it because of the lack of education that they might
Well,
have?
many of
or-
these children that I'm working with
Yeah.
are in very rural areas. There
Yeah.
aren't, there is no education, and really the healers, or what Western people call the medicine men, or the
Yeah,
but the healers have a great deal of control over society, over those villages.
Yeah. Over the information.
Over
that
the
they-
information that they get.
Yeah.
So if they say to them that people with albinism hold a magical power, then and if those healers are willing to pay a top dollar price for a piece of their hair, a finger, an arm, then people
This
are
still
willing.
goes on
Oh
today.
yes, it goes
Oh,
on today.
yes,
Yes,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
still
And
going on
that's-
today.
And that's why I think your book came at the right time, and it was we needed Children of the Moon
To come out about that.
Did you feel that? Is the journalist in I don't want to spoil it, but is the journalist in Children of the Moon a little bit of you doing
I
research?
think so. I think Seraphim is a bit of me, the Brazilian journalist who is there to document Poe's life and her story, and I think that there's a part of the author in that story, because he's also treading a very delicate line about fact and fiction, and I think as a writer I am as well. How do you record a story that is not your lived experience? I am not a person of color. I do not have albinism. I am, how do you tell that story as honestly, as purely as you can? So those concerns that I have as a writer are imbued in the character of Seraphim, and he shares those same concerns. But, back to your question, Jamie, how do you approach this? With a certain arrogance, because I called Peter Ash, who is the CEO of Under the Same Sun, which is an organization that helps people with albinism. He himself has albinism. And they're in Burnaby, British Columbia. And I called him and I spoke to him for an hour. And he's like, "But why are you calling?" and I said, "Because you're taking me." And he said, "What?" I go, "This because I want to go. You're going to take me to Tanzania the next time you go." And he said, "Why should I take you?" And I said, "Because it's such an incredible story, and it's not reaching the right people. And maybe if it's told through fiction, maybe there will be a readership that will take notice and perhaps
And understand
But
that
you
problem.
need to be there to understand
Yes.
that
So
background.
I went to Africa that first time, to Tanzania, with Peter Ash.
How was that adventure?
Wow.
I was going to say stories you want to share with us.
That was wild.
Give us a good story. Give us a good story.
I went there with this list, like a journalist, like Seraphim, with a list of all these questions that I was going to ask these parents, these children that I was going to interview. You know that I didn't ask one question.
That's why I asked, because I see a lot of you in Seraphim. I really do.
I didn't ask one
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Because what was more important than me asking the questions was me sitting down and listening to whatever the story they wanted to tell me, to whatever aspect, small thing of life challenge that they experience day in, day out. The actual physical issues that they had as a result of being attacked, the issues that they felt about being ostracized by their community or running away from their community to save their children because they were being hunted. Those all took a back seat because I could see it in their eyes and in their faces and in their stories. I didn't have to ask any questions.
Was that the moment when Paul was born? I have
That
to
is
say
the
Paul.
moment. That is the moment when Paul was born. Yeah,
Yeah.
when Paul was born. Yeah. And I met a particular woman who just walked into the room, and I knew she was an older woman, a much older woman, which is very strange, very rare for someone with albinism to reach the age of 60 or 70 years old. Most of them die of skin cancer by the age of 20 or so because they don't protect their skin. So incredible to see this woman, and she became my heroine. Yeah, she was remarkable.
So I'm still waiting for the story.
Oh God, there are so many stories. So many stories. I can't tell you. I'll tell you this.
What was the biggest? Okay, let me help you then. What was the biggest shock? Like something that you were really not expecting, and you're like, wow, okay, so this is happening. Because I'm sure, I mean, going across all the way.
Culturally, of course, it was so diverse, so different from what I understood. But there was so much color. There was so much laughter. There was lots of food and joy and music. Yes, there was poverty.
But they were happy.
Yeah,
in a way.
They didn't
in a
have
way,
so
right?
poverty in the sense that we would call it poverty.
But they're fine.
But they did with less, and they did well with less. And I'll tell you this, it got very bad for me because after spending those 5 weeks there and coming home,
It's another shock, right?
yeah, and that one I didn't take too well. So
Interesting.
I came home to my wife and my 3 boys and my nice home and, and my car and
all the little things that we take for
all the little
granted.
things that I've been working my whole life for and I have attained. And I just thought it was a crock of shit. Like I just thought it was.
Yeah. Do
awful.
do
All
we
of a
really need
sudden,
all of this?
How did I get to this place? Who am I? Is this what I signed up for? And my children and my wife and my family, is this really what I wanted? And it led me into a very quick spiral out of myself. So much so that after I'd say about 3 months, it caused such tension that I had to go speak to someone about it to try to figure out why it was. I felt culpable.
But you're not the first person I hear talking about this side of things. When you go into a country that's underdeveloped, that is poor, and to see the people there and how they live, and then a lot of people go through what you went through because it's a shock. It's literally 2 different worlds, if you look at it.
It's very difficult to imagine in my understanding of the way I live that I have everything, but I didn't have half of
what they had.
what they had.
Yeah.
And that's a very difficult thing to come to terms with.
One of those things, yeah.
So, and I wasn't prepared for that. I have to say I was not prepared for that.
Wow. So Africa is this beast that conquers you without you even noticing.
Of course, and it will always remain that way. But it's a beast in the sense that a Western point of view has created.
Heart of darkness?
Yes, it's what we imagine.
Yeah.
But it's not that place. As I said, there was song and there was music and there was real affection and a sense of kinship. I thought of myself growing up on Palmerston Avenue where I lived in this house and my grandmother lived in that house 2 houses down and my uncle lived across the street and we all kind of grew up as a village. And, I'd walk into these villages and realize that everyone was related to everyone else. And you can fight and quarrel, but the minute one of your own was near you, you protected them like there was no tomorrow. And everyone took turns, it takes a village. Everyone took turns raising those children and raising that next generation. And
It's the tribal mentality.
Yes, and we had kind of lost, I felt like I had lost touch with that.
Are there any more stories that remain untold from
the trips?
Oh, I think it's vast. Would I do it? I don't know. Again, I never like getting comfortable with one story. I always feel like I could probably write something more to this. I could probably do another book completely, like two books. But the reality is there's something really beautiful about finishing a book and finishing it in a way that is unfinished, if you understand what I'm saying. Yeah. To invite the reader in so that they can finish the story themselves.
I think that's why I had to read it twice. I believe that's what it was. There was so much that I was like, okay, what now? Where do I go now? Yeah. And I became part of. You have that in me. I become part of your stories for some reason. But yeah, I felt like you made me see the Africa I never met. I never saw. Right?
And you know what? I would say, you know, in terms of creativity and design and
that's what I was.
You know, one
into.
of these things about writing for me is some of the strongest parts of my writing, or what I hope are the strongest parts of my writing, are the white blanks, are the spaces that I don't write about, are the spaces that I allow the reader to infer, to fill in themselves, to make it their own. And I think that's, you know, one of the strengths of the world of design is when we do that, is when we say, this is not what I'm selling you.
This is the idea.
This is the idea, and you have to fit the idea into your world, into your 100%. Understanding of that world. And I think that's the best kind of advertisement. That's the best kind of marketing. That's the best kind of book, when you've actually allowed the participant to feel like they have a vested interest in the product, in the story.
100%.
I agree.
Now, aside from the writing, the covers are very interesting to me, obviously, as an artist. How much involvement did you have in these?
I'm going to be honest with you. I have no involvement because I was initially promised that I'd have tons of involvement. In fact, my editor said, they're going to give you 4 jackets and you get to choose them. And that never happened. I will say this, though. For my first book, Barnacle Love, I remember I was...
But did you give the ideas at least of what you wanted to do? No.
What they do is the designers, in this case, Terry Nemo, Scott Richardson. So Terry Nemo gets a copy of the book. She reads the book. And she actually, book designers...
This is her interpretation.
Yes, the book designers will pick something out and they'll run away with it. So my very first book, when they sent me the cover, I was mini golfing with my children in Niagara Falls. And it's my first book. I'm so excited to see this cover. And I'm just waiting for the appointment where I'm going to go see the 4 covers to choose from. Instead, I get this email from my editor that says, here's your cover. I hope you like it.
One.
And I opened it up and I just it came up slowly. And I hated it. And it was in a sepia tone, and it looked what I thought it would look like. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And I was disappointed in that.
You wanted to be surprised.
I wanted to be surprised. I wanted someone to see this as a modern look at an immigrant story, as opposed to something that was traditional, the sepia tone, some ruffled old newspapers on the jacket. I didn't want that.
Yeah.
And so I said to my agent, to my editor, I said, she said, what do you think? I said, it's very nice. She goes, nice doesn't cut it. And she said, you're not thrilled, are you? You can be honest with me. I said, Martha, and she goes, you know what? I'm not either. Okay. Let's take it back. And then Terry came up with this. And, I loved the idea of a young blonde boy holding up a fish, the sacrificial fish. It said a lot. It was beautifully modern. The color popped. It was really nice. And I thought, this is a fantastic cover. So that was great.
And it got translated, I might say, into Portuguese.
Yes, it did.
As Terra Nova.
Terra Nova.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, this cover... Of course, the designer focused on the laneways, and this was a really special cover. I have to say that I wasn't a big fan of this cover in many respects. This was done, although it looks like a Toronto alley, an artist from Montreal was commissioned, and listen, publishing houses don't do this often. They commissioned an artist to design the landscape of a laneway. This one in Montreal, but it looks so much like the one.
I was going to say, can we walk there right
Yes,
now?
I know, we could. And they used a special paper. It was all done, in a very special way. A great deal of attention was paid to it. And it got a terrific response.
It was beautiful.
Small things, like I suggested this. So you see the G.
Yeah, the kicking.
The kicking, the G at the end is just one notch up. It wasn't. And I was the one who suggested, look, what do you think if we just kind of playfully popped up
Just
that
put it
G?
up. Yeah.
So small things like this. Terry Nemo comes
What about
back.
the choice, going back to this one, hold on.
Decal
Give me 1
edge?
sec. Yes.
Yeah.
Did you choose that?
No.
They chose.
No, they
Okay.
chose a decal edge, which I actually always liked in books.
I love
I
it.
like
Because
it.
it
That's
makes
why
it
I'm asking.
easier.
Yeah.
It makes it easier to turn the page. But a decal edge has a certain quality, this kind of rawness to it, and I think that's what they were going for. That's why everything is very matte. If you can feel the cover, it doesn't feel like a.
Yeah.
It's got a waxy texture to it, and then you got this decal edge. It was absolutely beautiful.
I loved it.
And then Terry Nemo comes back with this one, and I have to say this
Was
one
that the first choice right away?
no, it was a total surprise, and I loved it. So what happened was that my editor was saying that she was playing with the idea of a child's hands playing with an elephant carving.
Oh.
And you read it, so you would know what that means. And I thought, oh, that's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. So 2 weeks later, when I get the JPEG for this and I open it up on my computer, I'm going, where the hell's the elephant? And yet, I loved it. I loved it from the minute that I saw it. These are very kind of primitive strung beads.
Yep.
They left one bead. They did small things. Terry did small things like the embossing in the front cover, which, no one in public, like they don't take.
It's the details.
It's the details. And my editor is particular about selection of page, selection of size of the book. All of that stuff.
Everything needs to feel
yes,
right.
it just has to feel like the right package.
Yeah.
Very proud of the way all of
But
them
we also have on the cover inside another surprise that you were mentioning and that I noticed. That the hardcover there.
Yeah, the embossing.
Yeah, that's what he was saying.
Yeah,
Embossing.
that
That's
it's
the- oh.
embossed.
That's okay.
So to see that repetition
Repetition, okay.
embossed, to see that every time you
Yeah,
turn,
there's that
there
too.
are the 3 dots,
Yeah.
throughout, spattered throughout. It's really kind of beautiful that they take
Yeah.
that much. And they should.
They should.
They
Absolutely,
should
I
because
agree.
not only does it reflect the writer's work, but you are asking people to pay $32 or $28 and in this time of day and age where people
Yeah.
want everything free and cheap and
There has to be some
streamed,
difference.
you got to have something that people want to keep and hold in their hands.
Yeah, for sure.
Last question I want to give you. If somebody out there is thinking about writing, but is, I don't know if I can write, what's your advice? Hold on.
Narrow it down.
Okay,
Yeah.
let-
because-
Get his wife to kick him out of the house.
I just got.
Go.
Let's rework this question.
yeah.
Anthony, if you were able to give the 21-year-old Anthony an advice regarding writing, what would it be?
You would think that it would say to that 21-year-old Anthony, start younger. Just do it. I wouldn't. I think that and I see a lot of now 26-year-old, 28-year-old writers, and they write what they know. They write about their own time and their own place, and it's wonderful.
So do you value experience of life?
Yes. I can't.
You have to.
I can't write about life if I haven't lived. I can't.
It's almost like these life coaches out there that are 20 years old.
I know, like, really? Or asking a priest to give you marriage advice.
Hey,
I mean, I don't want to go there, but
that was my question.
But that's a hard thing.
Okay.
That's a hard thing to do. How do you, as a young couple, as Catholic, how do you, as a young couple, go and speak to your parish priest about marital advice?
It's true.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah,
No experience
you know
there.
what? So I guess what I'm saying is that, and I get this question often, especially now that I'm coming towards the end of my book tour. I meet a lot of writers on the road. I was just in Calgary, so are you, the question inevitably between writers is, what are you working on now? Like, you've just put this one to bed, and I'm sure there are some writers who finish it, send it to their editors, and the next day
start a
wake
new
up in the
one.
morning and start a new one. I'm sure that those crazy people exist. I give myself 6 months to a year before I start anything new. And the truth is, and I don't write every day. You know, I go to a lot of these places where there's workshops, and writers will say, well, to be a serious writer, you need to work at it every day, a certain. Well, you know what? That's impossible in my life. I have a full-time career.
Yeah.
I have a young family. I have other.
Yeah. Gets
The
hard.
truth is, I need to engage with the world if I'm going to write about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's really what's important. That's the advice that I would give. Live life, enjoy it, and write about something that you're excited about and something that you understand, at least in this context, in this framework. I would hate a 27-year-old to write a book about, you know,
Being
what it's
60.
like. Yes. I wouldn't say no. I think if they have a fresh take on it, I think
It
that's
could work.
fantastic.
Yeah.
It could work.
But I think that there is something to be said about lived experience.
I think it just keeps things authentic.
Yeah, that's all.
Do you
That's
have
all.
like a particular corner of the house you need to go to
No.
write? Do you have one? No way.
I mean, I have my office where I do a
Yeah.
bit of writing. I like to, here's another thing. I like to go to a cafe and I like to sit down and I like to write and observe. You know, the other day I was seeing someone and they had just finished what they were eating on one of those very little flimsy paper plates. And I just couldn't stop watching her. And she took the paper plate and she folded it in half. And with the edge of it, she picked her teeth.
Oh, some things have to be done.
Okay?
Wow.
Loved it. I had to write it down. I don't know if I'll ever use it. Or about 2 months ago, I was on book tour and this woman was having French fries. I love people when they eat. I like observing. She had the longest nails I've ever seen to a jagged point. And she was eating the French fries by harpooning them with her nail.
Never saw that.
I've never seen it in my life. So something like that gets me so excited
I'm not eating beside
as
you.
a writer.
Because you're like, okay.
Oh my God. So
got
I
that.
write that down. I may never use it.
Okay, coffee, that's it.
But the idea that someone is capable of doing that in the real world is fascinating to me. And if I could,
It's just that ammunition that you need, right?
give that a little something to my to my readers, and I like that. I like that part of the world.
Well, I want to congratulate you on having this as an audiobook.
Yes, they're all on audiobook.
It's already available at the Toronto Public Library.
We'll
Children
take
of
care
the
of
Moon.
also putting all of the links and every
And-
single place
and
that is
so
available
I
for
wanna,
you guys
I want to
to
listen
check it
to
out.
it now.
And listen to it and read it and all of that. Anthony, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
I hope
both.
you enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, it was great. It was
And I
wonderful.
hope you're here next year for the next book.
Next year.
You see anything?
Joking.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Artlist.io